Jesus has been portrayed in such a strange way in the Bible. How he was taken and crucified, how he was laid in a tomb. They came to the tomb and they found that the tomb is empty. And so we're looking at that instance to this point. We've got to that point now. And we're looking mostly at what Luke has to say in Luke chapter 24, verse 10 and 11. And to remind you what it basically spoke about, it says, "And the woman were Mary of Magdala, Joanna, and Mary the mother of James, and they, with other women, told the apostles. But the story appeared to be to the apostles when they heard the story about Jesus being resurrected from the grave, not being in the grave and being alive and living. They said in verse 11, this was nonsense, and they would not believe them." Now it is worth remembering that the apostles did not believe the story even after the angels had reminded the woman of what Jesus himself had told him earlier, that he will be dead, he'll rise again 3 days later, and all the rest of it. So if this is actually what Jesus, peace be upon him, was supposed to have said, then why did they not believe this prophecy? This is in itself an issue of great doubt, whether Jesus had indeed prophesied about himself being raised from the dead after 3 days, or if this was a later addition that was put in by some later scribe or some later church leaders. There are many doubtful entries in various versions. Some versions consider that verse 12 that we looked at in the King James Version is not authentic, and they say that this shouldn't even be there and place it in brackets, or they put parentheses, and they say that this is of a very doubtful nature. And so this is how it should actually read once you've taken the doubtful nature out. And it reads such: "Then rose Peter and ran into the sepulchre," or the grave, "and stooping down, he beheld the linen cloth laid by itself, and departed, wondering to himself at what had come to pass." And that's the end of it. There is no angel, there's nothing else, it's just simply that. We have to keep wondering why Peter, or even if we accept the other versions, why the woman, when they came into the grave, did not pick up that holy shroud, but rather left it in the sepulchre, as we see the text saying. I'm sure you would have picked it up, carried it with you as evidence and proof, and say, remember we wrapped him in this? He's no longer wrapped in this. But somehow they managed to leave this shroud, or this holy shroud. Now, John knows how to make drama out of a simplest thing. So he can't leave the story like this. So he brings Mary of Magdala to the tomb alone. So it says in the text that she saw that the stone had been moved away from the entrance, yet she did not go in, but ran to Simon Peter and the other disciples, and the one whom Jesus loved. And we know who that is. John likes to talk about himself in this super name. He calls himself the one that Jesus loved, instead of just saying, and John. The text continues by saying, "Then they have taken away the Lord from the tomb," she told them, "and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter and the others that she told this set out and made their way to the tomb. They were running side by side, but the one disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He peered in and saw that the linen that he was wrapped in was laying there, but he did not enter. Then Simon Peter came up, following him, and he went inside the tomb. He saw that the linen that he was wrapped in, how it was lying, and the napkin which was over his head was lying with the wrappings rolled together in the place by itself. When the disciple who had reached the tomb first went in too, and saw, and he believed. Until then, they did not understand the scripture, which stated that he must rise from the dead. This is all found in John chapter 20, verse 1 to 9. Well, these raise a huge number of questions, which we'll try to go through step by step, inshallah, a little bit later. Now, it would be very unlikely that John would simply stop his story there. So he continues with his story. Instead of just leaving it there, he must go a little bit further. So the disciples went home again, But Mary stood at the tomb, outside the tomb, weeping. As she wept, she peered into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white sitting there, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had laid. They said to her, "Why are you weeping?" She answered, "They have taken my Lord away, and I do not know where they have laid him." With these words, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there, but she did not recognize him. Jesus said to her, "Why are you weeping? Who is it that you are looking for?" Thinking that it was just a gardener, she said, "If it is you, sir, who removed his body, please tell me where you have laid him, for they have taken him away." Jesus said, "Mary." She turned to him and said, "Rabbi," which in Hebrew means my master. Jesus said, "Do not cling to me." Some versions say, "Do not handle me." Other versions say, "Do not touch me anymore, for I have not ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them that I am going to ascend to my Father and my God and your Father," as it says in John chapter 20, verse 10 to 17. So this is interesting, and there's a lot to be dealt with in this little section that we're looking at. Interesting, she does not protest about the removal of the dead body from the tomb. She doesn't say, "Where have you taken his dead body?" but talks about him as if he is a living person. Like, where have you hidden this man? She wants to take him away. She is not trying to find where his body is to bury him properly. When he discloses himself to her, it is not surprising. She does not go to him and say, "But aren't you supposed to be dead?" and things like that. But she wants to cling to him, so she's not surprised by this. The other interesting thing is that it says that she did not recognize him. It seems to be an issue with all the people on the post-resurrection of Jesus. No one recognizes him and sees him for what he is. It's also interesting that even though two angels came down from heaven and told them, and they hear it, that she still did not believe. And then even when Jesus tells her, then she only, once she recognized, or we told that she recognized him later, then she only believes. So it takes a lot to convince the people of those days. Even seeing him physically was not enough for them simply to believe. Now Mary of Magdala went to the disciples with the news that she was told, and she says, "I have seen the Lord," she said, and gave them the message that Jesus had told her to give, which we can read about in John chapter 20 and verse 18. Now it is important to note that in the Gospel of Mark, it is a youth who tells her, "He has been raised again." So it's the youth who says that. But according to Matthew, it is an angel of the Lord who descends from heaven and tells her that, like, he is not here, he's been raised again. Both the Gospels tell us that she was told that Jesus will see the disciples in Galilee. Matthew even tells us that the 11 disciples made their way to Galilee and saw him there. Luke brings in two men in dazzling garments. So there's a youth, there's one angel, now there are two men in dazzling garments in Luke's version. Yet when this news was brought to the disciples, the story apparently was nonsense to them, and they would not believe it. And it says in the text, if we read what the text says, the same day the two of them went on their way to a village called Emmaus, which lay about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And while they are on their way, they're talking to each other. There happened to be on their way, while they were talking in the discussion, another one. Jesus himself came up to them and began talking to them, and something kept the true appearance of who he was from them. So here again, on this account, we see that Jesus appears to two people randomly while they're on their way to another village, and yet when they see him, they're unable to identify, because the text says, but something kept them from seeing who he was. And he asked them while he was walking with them, "What is it that you are debating as you are walking on the road here?" They halted from walking and their faces were filled with gloom. And the one called Cleophas answered, "Are you the only person staying in Jerusalem not to know what has happened there in these last few days?" And Jesus said to them, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "All this about Jesus of Nazareth," they replied, "a prophet powerful in speech and actions before God and the whole people. How our chief priests and rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death and crucified him. But we, being hopeful that he was a man who would come to liberate Israel." Well, let's take a break, and when we get back from the break, we will continue with that, inshallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Before the break, we were reading Luke chapter 24, verse 13 to 24. And we're talking about how these men were walking on the road, and as they're walking on the road, Jesus appears to them, and yet they did not recognize him. The scriptures in the Bible say that they were unable to recognize him, or some versions say it was made so they did not recognize him. As he's walking with these people, he says to them, "Why you look so upset?" And they say, "Are you the only person in the whole city who doesn't know what's been going on?" He says, "What has been going on?" And they say, "Well, Jesus was crucified. He was handed over by the chief priests. He was handed over by the rabbis, and they took him captive. They eventually took him and crucified him." And they said, "But we were expecting that he would be a man who would liberate Israel. What is more, this is the third day since it happened," and I'll continue quoting now from the text. "It is the third day since this has happened, and some of the women in our company have astounded us, because when they went to their tomb, they failed to find his body, and they returned with the story that he had been raised, that he was alive, and they had seen a vision of an angel. So some of our people went to the tomb, and they found this just as the woman had said, but him they did not see." In other words, Jesus they did not see. So this is the account that is given in Luke chapter 24, verse 13 to 24. Now, it is noteworthy how this story has developed. If we set aside the later edition of Mark's Gospel, which is Mark chapter 16 and verse 9 to 20, which is not to be found in the ancient manuscripts or older manuscripts, we see that the story ends after some people have noted that the body was missing. From now on, the myth starts to build up, as they always do when there is a part of the story missing. Both Matthew and Mark were writing for early Christians. The story of Jesus telling either himself or through the youth that the woman must go now on to Galilee, and according to Matthew, that they would meet him there and that he must meet his disciples with him. More and more stories are slowly added onto the story. Simply go and meet me, you will see me there. Now we have a whole intermediate story going on in between. Scripture writings, especially in the Bible, are very, very fond of making short things long. One of the things that you will find when reading the Quran is everything is made very, very simple. There's no long stories telling you go left, and then when you go left, go 300 meters to the right, and then go north by northeast, and you'll find a little shop there, and by that shop you'll find a lamppost, and above the lamppost you'll see a decoration hanging. There's none of that. It's just straightforward. This is how you get to paradise. This is how you must obey Allah. This is how you must do this. This is how you must do it. Very, very simple. But in scripture writing, they'll find that they are very prone to digging out as much as you can out of event as possible and putting as much storytelling into the dialogue as possible. Every event is authenticated by somehow manipulating Old Testament scriptures or verses from the Old Testament to give them an air of prophecy. Or they will be brought in to make the characters look larger than life. And so what we see here is this story as these people are walking and Jesus is walking with them. Jesus is now supposedly saying to these disciples the following: how stupid are you? Or, as some accounts say, how dull are you? He answered and said to them. He says to them then, how slow are you to believe all that the prophet said? Now listen, this is very interesting, because this is Jesus talking supposedly after the resurrection, talking about himself. And Jesus is now talking to these people, and he says to them, how dull are you? How slow are you to believe all that the prophets have said? Was the Messiah not bound to suffer this before entering into his glory? Then he began with Moses and all the prophets and explained to them the passages which refer to himself in every part of the scripture. By this time he had reached the village to which they were going, and he made as if he was going to go on with his journey. But they pressed him, saying, why don't you stay with us for the evening, because the evening draws near and the day is almost over. So he went in and he stayed with them. But before I continue with how the text goes, let me just explain something here. He refers to, why do you so dull not to believe all that the prophets told you? And then it says he went on to explain himself in all the different scriptures, starting with Moses, may Allah be pleased with him, all the way to him who was a prophet at that time. But we are not given any of these references. So if he's going and showing all these messages that he was prophesied in, it would be nice if even one of those prophecies could have been mentioned and recorded, so that we could now read them and look at them and say, oh, of course, man, that's exactly what he was saying. Oh yes, that's so true. That is exactly what it means. We're given nothing. We're just given a statement. So let's continue now for the rest of the story that is found in Luke chapter 24, from the beginning right up to verse 28. And it says, and so he went to stay with them in their house, because it was already night. So he agrees to stay with them in their house. And when he sat down with them at the table, he took the bread and said the blessing over the bread and broke the bread and offered it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they realized that it was him. And he vanished from their sight. So as soon as he took the bread and he broke the bread and he gave it to them and he gave the offering, then their eyes were opened and they realized that it was him. And as they realized him, poof, he disappeared into thin air and vanished. They said to one another, did we not feel our hearts on fire as he talked to us on the road and explained the scriptures to us? So this is all according to Luke chapter 24. So in this account, there are very odd things happening. He's about to have a meal and he disappears right as he's given the blessing. And they only realize it's him once he breaks the bread. Other than that, they do not recognize that it's him. So this seems to be a general consensus with the post-resurrected Jesus. Could this really be the Jesus who would now be on his way to Galilee to convey his message to his disciples? Or could this be someone else that they had met? Before we proceed or go any further, I would like to make a little note that the angel told the woman that he is alive. The angel doesn't say he is resurrected. The angel says he is alive in the flesh. Now these two disciples are talking to this dear one with whom they had been roaming all over Judea and Galilee, yet they did not recognize, even when he gives a long discourse supposedly going through all the scriptures talking about himself. When they did not recognize his voice only, then they could not have even perhaps looked at his holes in his feet, as we will hear in later scriptures, or perhaps noticed the holes in his hand, or the lashes all over his body where he was allegedly whipped, or pieces of his beard that had been taken out, or the black eye that he received, or any of these markings were not appeared. They did not see them in any way. So they did not recognize not only his voice or any of the appearances that he had. Yet even though he was all flesh, as it's tried to be made out through this, as it is often emphasized by Christian theologians and clergy. As soon as they recognized him, what happens? He turns into a ghost and vanishes into thin air. So if he is, as the Christian theologians and clergy will say, all flesh, how, if he was all flesh, was he able to just vanish into thin air? He could slip away quietly without doing the vanishing act. Surely he could have just stood up, stepped up, and walked away without doing the vanishing part. Was this a ruse to avoid him being pursued or properly identified by the people? And they will say, well, you sound like Jesus, and then they try to investigate and find that it wasn't him. Well, it could have been like this, but we do know for a fact that if this was so, that he was able to just vanish, well, he could have simply done exactly the same thing and vanished through the tomb. What was the point of rolling away the stone? If he had the ability to vanish and just walk through walls, as we hear him being able to do earlier, then there is no need to roll away stones. He could have just walked through the stone or appeared on the other side of the grave. So this gives more questions than answers. It creates more problems than anything else. So by the fact that the writer writes and that he vanished, it gives us the problem of then why bother rolling away a stone from the entrance? If he was able to vanish, it creates big problems. So perhaps it would have been better if they said, and he walked out of the room on his way to meet the disciples. But I'm sure maybe 5 or 6 or 10 or 100 years from now, that is how it will read. And someone will miraculously find a document that hasn't been found before that suddenly has that part added into it. Now, it continues to say that without a moment's delay, they set out and returned to Jerusalem. There they found the other 11, and the rest of the company had assembled. And they were saying, this is true, the Lord has risen, he has appeared to Simon. This is found in Luke chapter 24, verse 33 to 34. So this is the story that we've got up to so far. Well, this is all the time we have for this week. So till next week, same place, same time. So for me, Areeb Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.